Good morning. Welcome to the Milliard Museum. For those of you who are fortunate enough not to know who I am, my name is John Clayton. I'm the Executive Director of the Manchester Historic Association and this, our Milliard Museum. A question I ask anytime we have a gathering, please raise your hand if you are here at the Milliard Museum for the first time.
Look at that.
Okay, you can never say that again. And yes, my Aunt Sandy is among those who just raised her hand. We'll have words later about her not having been here before. This is a great program, and look at the turnout. Obviously, there's great interest in the subject of the Amoskeag ledge, and soon we will hear from our board chair, Ed Brouder, who's done this presentation at least once before. He's modified it, he's improved it. He showed me pictures of my grandfather, Ted Leaf, who was one of the Brownies divers that I had never seen before. I didn't think that was possible. That's how much research Ed has put into this. So those of you who raise your hand and are here for the first time, you may not know that we receive no city, state, or federal funding. We are completely funded by memberships, which begin as low as $25 if you happen to be a senior citizen. I don't see any here today. But if you wait a little while, you'll get in for $25. That entitles you to unlimited visits throughout the year, discounts in the gift shop, discounts on our sensational walking tours of Manchester cemeteries and historic North End, and others too many to name right here. So, other things we have coming up in the near future, including a book signing relative to the covered bridges of New Hampshire. Our friend Irene Dupont has done a great book on the bridges. And a new author, Michael Bruno, has done a book chronicling each of those green historic markers you see on the highways and byways of New Hampshire. He'll be speaking here on April 6th, and our board member, Gail York, is here. So I have to remind you that our Historic Preservation Awards are May 21st at St. Anselm College this year. Later this week, we'll be announcing the recipients of those 5 prestigious awards. It will be our 27th annual Preservation Awards, and we hope you'll join us. If you've never been, Ed and I do a duo. It's pretty cool. You know, Hollywood has beckoned us, but thus far we've refrained from going to that length. So with that, again, I welcome you all, and it's my pleasure to introduce my good friend and colleague, Ed Brouder. He's the chairman of the board of the Manchester Historic Association. If you don't recognize his voice, you went to too many Who concerts in the day and you're deaf. Ed has a long and storied career in radio, and now he's working with New Hampshire Public Radio as well. So please join me in welcoming Ed Brouder.
Here.
Thank you, John.
No, before you go, don't you want to introduce the DVD?
If we're going to play, yes.
Because you know the details of exactly when that was filmed. When you see the young person in here impersonating John Clayton, you'll all be astounded. Then you'll want to giggle. So.
Yeah. This is a piece that I did with Fritz Weatherby for New Hampshire Public Television for an episode of New Hampshire Remembered. Thanks to Fritz, the producer, he was able to secure footage of the 1929 Winter Carnival featuring the Amoskeag Brownies in their element, diving through holes in the ice and playing chess and checkers, things you can't imagine. You will see me sitting on the ledge. Please know that 3 of my brothers were firefighters, and there's a reason I was not. It has a lot to do with heights. So when you see me perched on the edge of the ledge, you'll know that I'm not mimicking my grandfather's diving exploits. I have a photo in my office. I'll be happy to show you all later of my grandfather diving from a tree, a platform atop a tree at 129 feet above the ledge. And I keep that in my office to prove that insanity runs in my family. So stop me and ask me to see it later on. Ed, can you cue up the video? This is a warm-up for Ed.
The old swimming hole, remember? This is the old Amoskeag ledge in Manchester up in Derryfield Park. As a kid, I used to sneak into the quarries, dive into the cold spring water from the high cliffs. They used to be higher than they are here, by the way. Of course, you couldn't tell your mother. Mother said that the quarries were far too dangerous. You were supposed to be sensible. Some kids were in her day, or her mother's day. They knew how to have a good time sensibly.
Gee, I'm sorry for those people down in Florida.
Yes, they could be playing checkers with us right here.
Crazy people like me go crazy over people like you. goofy people, busy people like me go nutty over things that you do.
Well, here we have some of Mother's contemporaries, some sensible kids of yesterday. And where are they? Well, they're at the Amoskeag Ledge. They were called the Manchester Brownies, and back in the 1920s and 30s, they were famous all over the world. It was not unusual for 10,000 people to crowd the Amoskeag Ledge to see the Brownies set world high diving records.
It was a thrill. It was a thrill watching them because, you know, you put yourself into their body and you're going into the water, but you never realize what it's like until you go into the water yourself. We would go there and I would watch them and I'd think, oh goodness, they're little, you know. But it wasn't long they persuaded me to become a Brownie too.
You have me acting like a loon. It must be love, sweet love.
It felt great when it came out. It felt good. It felt great. And I never had a cold all that time. I mean, we were very healthy. We came from Haverhill, Massachusetts, and you people had the blue laws, no movies. I'm dating myself. And, well, my mother used to bring us up. There's nothing else to do, we thought. She brought us up, and we loved it. We told her we were going to join. And she said, go ahead. She thought we were fooling.
We didn't mind it. You're circulating your blood. That's why we didn't mind it, because we're circulating our blood. You stand there and watch us, you're freezing.
Cold certainly didn't bother Leona Sullivan Cousins when she dove 55 feet into the quarry and set the women's world high diving record.
No, height didn't mean anything to me. But, I don't know. I didn't feel anything. I never looked down. Oh, I couldn't look down. I looked up. And just go right off. You see how they dive today? Whew, they do everything. But they were trained. They had coaches. We didn't have no coach. Wasn't trained or anything. Now, like when I first dove off at 25, I saw the boys going. And I said, they can do it, I can. So I just threw myself off, and how I like. So I cleared the water. And Dan said to me, he stopped me, he says, Leona, he says, you take it easy, take things gradually going up. And he says, what do? He says, put your feet together and spring. That's all the encouragement I had. So I did. That's how I went off 55. That's the only lesson I had. Then when I see the others going, and I watch them, and of course, if I had a coach, it'd be different.
When the kids started swimming here, it was very informal in the beginning, but there was a gentleman who used to hang out around this area. He used to ride around on horseback. His name was Daniel P. Connor. And he decided if he was going to be here, he wanted the kids to swim safely, so he started teaching them how to swim. Gradually, they expanded this summer swimming program into the winter months. He felt it was more healthy to swim in the winter and spring, if you can believe that. And so he created this group, and they developed a term called Brownies from their brown swimsuits. It went one step further with the winter swimming. They became super Brownies if you could swim every day of the year at the ledge. They do this through a hole in the ice. Gradually, it grew to the point where they had winter carnivals, and they would carve holes in the ice and dive from these very rocks from 55 feet and actually 108 feet from a tree high above the water, and drew incredible spectator interest. Folks from movie-tone newsreels and Fox and Pathé would come and show these films all over the world of these spectacular Manchester Super Brownies, and these kids brought great renown to this city at the time. When you talk about the Brownies, the best thing about them is that they weren't imported stuntmen. These were local folks. In fact, my grandfather, Ted Leaf, was one of the Super Brownies. These guys were nuts. I mean, I can't describe it any other way. So were the women. They would dive through these holes in the ice in the winter in high winds, and no big deal. They do it frequently, several times. Scramble back up and get back in camera position and go out and do it again. There are folks around town who still have family members who were Brownies, and we all have photos on the walls, and we all cherish those memories. But would I do it? Not in this lifetime.
Don't mind me if I rave along. Sweet angel child, it's just a habit that I've got. You drive me wild, I'm so wild.
We got a telegram to go to Lake Placid, and that's when it started. And we all thought we'd love to go. And then some of the fellows said they wouldn't go unless they got paid. And that's really what started the breakup, because we go because we enjoyed it, we loved it, it was fun. But they wanted to make professional clubs, so it disbanded.
In 1930, the city of Manchester closed the Amoskeag Ledge. Too dangerous. Of course, the kids continued to sneak in to swim. I remember going there one hot summer night about 1952. And today, here where hundreds of swimmers used to romp, where high diving world records were shattered, where a dozen or so Manchester young people once did something so wild it captured the imagination of the world. Here, today, you'd never recognize the place, for the water has been filled in, and only the remains of the cliffs are left to remind us of the craziness that once happened here.
Crazy people like me go crazy over people like you. Very, very crazy people.
John, what year was that?
The Winter Carnival footage was from 1929,
And what year did you prepare the piece?
1995.
95. Wait till you see the difference in the pictures showing what the place looks like today. It's so much different. Computer, here we go. Yeah. Give it a second to kick in. Incidentally, a couple of other people from our staff that I'd like to recognize today. The one who's doing our audiovisual is Daniel Peters, who's normally at our research center on Amherst Street, but not this Saturday. And Christy Ellsworth, who's been responsible for a lot of the logistics here today. Oops, I'm sorry. There, that should kick it, yeah. We don't need that. So welcome to the Super Brownies Lane. We don't know exactly where that picture was taken in the upper part. The lower part, of course, is a close-up, and this was somewhere up on Oak Hill. And in a sense, this is going to be kind of a 3-for-1 type of show. You get 3 stories in one. You're going to learn a little bit about the Amoskeag Ledge itself, why it was a rock quarry and what the Amoskeag Company did with it. We're also going to talk about the Brownies in some detail, and then we're also going to talk about the last part of it, why it closed, why the city wanted to get rid of it, and a Manchester socialite who for many years prevented that from happening. Maybe some of you know of Kennard Road, you might call it Kennard Road, it's up near the McIntyre ski area. Well, Nora Kennard Jones, who's about to pop in on the right picture here, was the socialite who kept the city from closing the ledge for many years, until her death, at which point the city had the upper hand. So, we're going back to a time when things were simpler. We all know our beloved Manchester Mill Yard. And before all of this existed, back in the days before there was color, the city looked like this. And for all those mill buildings that were on either side of the Merrimack River, they needed foundational stone, granite, on which to build these massive factories that were going to be filled with machinery which weighed tons and tons and tons. So they had to have very solid foundations because they were on sandy ground to start with along the river. This article appeared in 1840 in the Farmer's Monthly Visitor, published in Concord. A granite quarry upon the river and about 6 miles above Amoskeag, being a mountain affording an inexhaustible quantity of the very best of that beautiful material, belongs to the company, the Amoskeag Company, by purchase. Also an extensive stone quarry or ledge not very far from the site of the future city, this is the ledge that we're talking about, which, if it shall bear the name of the town in which it is located, may vie with another most extensive manufacturing town in England of the same name, will furnish in great abundance the material for foundation and cellar walls that do not require hewed stone. So the bricks in most of the Manchester mill yard were not made here. They were made in Hooksett, a little bit upriver, about 8 miles from here, because there was too much sand in the soil in this area. It was a better grade material to work with, so the bricks were made in Hooksett and floated down the river by barge. We now shift from the downtown section to a place across town. In fact, actually, you get to see it. This is the same rough area of town. It's a west side picture showing the east. In the left foreground, you see one of the old Bridge Street bridges. That was the one before the Green Arch Bridge that so many of us remember. And this building is 500 Commercial, where the Telge brewery operations are today, to give you a reference point. And if you look at the hill up here behind the smokestack, that's Oak Hill. That's where the ledge was. So they had all this granite up there, and they needed to get it down into the city where it could be used. But that's not actually the highest point in Manchester. The highest point in town is, and still is today, Bald Hill. You'd know it better today by Wellington Hill, on the other side of I-93. It's not much taller. It's 573 feet in elevation, which is just a couple of hundred feet higher than Oak Hill is. The purchases on the east side of Manchester that the Amoskeag Company made were significant. As you may know, the Amoskeag Company was formed by a group of investors from the Boston area. They envisioned a textile city along this river, powered by the river. And of course, this was all done pre-electricity, so they were using mechanical machines and water power to create this textile giant. Well, they made a lot of purchases of land which had pretty much just been not used farmland on the east side. Everything that we know today from Canal Street clear up to Mammoth Road, and roughly bounded by Webster Street down to about Granite Street. That was the center of the early city. The purchases on the east side were greater in number, consisting mainly of farms, and the following list was comprised in the Eddy map, made in 1835. Since then, what is known as the Ledge Lot has been acquired by the Amoskeag Company, and also quite a tract below the gasworks, which is a little bit closer to the north end of town here. The Ledge Lot, so-called, was among the early real estate acquisitions made by the Amoskeag Company. And they were doing this specifically because they knew that they needed a lot of granite, a lot of rock. And you see a little bit closer view of that same image. Stevens Pond, which you now see, because I-93 goes right down here next to it. And you've all driven by that pond, especially this time of year. You see the people out doing ice skating and ice fishing. The old city farm here. I have to get my bearings on this. You see where Darafield Park is, so obviously this would have been Bridge Street, intersecting with Mammoth Road. And you also see the Weston Observatory, the stone tower up at the top of Oak Hill, which was very close to Darafield Park, although they weren't necessarily built for the same purpose. They weren't built at the same time. This is yet a closer up view, and this one shows you where the tower is relative to the park and the high service reservoir, the first of the two reservoirs that are up there today providing city water. Lake Massabesic is Manchester's water source, and the water is pumped from Massabesic, where it's processed and purified, up to two holding tanks that are now up there today, and then fed by gravity down into the center city. That area just beyond the tower, which was north, was called Heath Hen Hill. Not heathen, but heath hen, named for a type of hen that used to run wild up in the area. This was also, at one time, the old Kidder Farm, which embraced, this was a huge tract, Pine Street between High and Harrison Streets, a farm owned by Samuel P. Kidder, who was the father of the late Joseph Kidder, and this was over 100 acres in size. It extended from the Merrimack River all the way up to Heath Hen Hill and ran between what's now High and Harrison Streets. Heath Hen Hill was not well known among the current generations, but its elevation is what we know today as Oak Hill. And of course, this is a close-up of the Heath Hen Hill, Mammoth Road, north to south here, and you can see a little bit of Smith Road up in the corner. This unlabeled street is what became Kennard Road, because a lot of the land up here was owned by some of the Kennard brothers, or the Kennard brothers, depending on your pronunciation, and we'll talk more about them later. Yet a different map. This was a survey map called the Rowell-McGregor Woodlot, and it indicated that the Amoskeag Company opened the first section of Granite Ledge in June of 1873, but abandoned it 2 months later. They then opened a different tract on the other side of the property in August of 1873. And they opened additional sections in 1876 and 1880. There was another nearby ledge, another granite quarry called the Bodwell Ledge. You've all heard of Bodwell Road. A lot of the early things in Manchester were named after the people who owned the property. Frank Bodwell was there, and after his death in 1910, that property passed into his wife's family, and it briefly became known as McCarthy's Ledge, but it was destroyed by the construction of I-93 back in the 1970s. So the Kennard family owned about half of the land that was here in the ledge. You can see the road to the Kennard's ledge over here. So they owned some of this property, and that will become a significant fact later on. These two photos are not the Amoskeag ledge, but they are indicative of what a ledge of that period looked like. You see the heavy-duty derricks with a lot of cables drilled into the rock for support, and they would have used these derricks with cables to slice sections of granite, shape it to the right size, and then move it onto a cart. This is a better picture that shows you how that happened. You see these huge chunks of granite, coffin-sized or so, and being lifted by rope and cable onto the back of a cart, either horse-drawn or oxen-drawn. Both were employed at different times here. It takes about 18 minutes today to walk by foot from the ledge, if we were able to cut right through the neighbor's property, right down Blodgett Street into the mill yard. So the granite that they mined up here in this quarry would have been about an 18 to 20 minute ride or walk away from its final destination. These two pictures are the Amoskeag ledge, and you get an idea of the depth of the actual mining operation. That in a relatively short period of years, they took a lot of rock out of this hill. It was on the high side to the south on the left and came right across to this area. And you see a man down at the bottom, and we don't know who that is, but look at some of the blocks of granite. And of course, again, this was all being mined by hand before machinery was powered by electricity. So these guys were pretty stalwart workers. The only other photo we have of the ledge at its heyday is this one. And people familiar with the property will recognize this is the south face, the highest point. And you see again the derricks. You also see a small lean-to at the bottom and maybe half a dozen workers that are in there. The thing that's significant, this picture first appeared in print in 1946 in a book on the city's bicentennial. Sorry, not bicentennial, centennial. And the significant thing about this photo is that there's already water down at the bottom. So this kind of debunks the myth that there was a cataclysmic event which suddenly caused a major flood which closed the rock quarry. There was water in there to some degree all along. So what did they do with this granite foundation? This is the Jefferson Mill under construction in 1886, just up the road here. You can see some very large chunks of granite, white granite down here in the forefront, and you can just barely see the Merrimack River over on the left edge of the picture. They would take some of this granite down here, and the stuff that was good quality, they would mine it into shapes and rectangles, and they would use that for foundation on which to build the rest of the building. But the stuff that wasn't as high a grade, they would just crush it and pitch it over into the riverbed to build up a foundation on which the more stalwart stuff would be placed later on. When the Jefferson was under construction, it was still known as Mill Number 10. And in 1885, October 10th, the Mirror, an American newspaper, published a lengthy article about it. It stated that stone for the east wall is being drawn from Kennard's ledge by Warren Harvey and emptied over the old wall onto the rocks below. What's significant about this is the Kennard ledge was really right up against the Amoskeag ledge, so this identifies exactly where this kind of rock was coming from. You can ask the question as to whether or not this was much of an industry in Manchester, and it really never was. We've compared figures from James Hanlon's research in his book, The Working Population of Manchester, 1840 to 86, in 1850, 60, 70, and 80, according to census records. And it shows that the total number in 1850 of textile workers in Manchester was more than 4,000. By 1860, that had ballooned to 5,500, and it was up to 7,000 plus in 1880. You look at these other professions, machine workers in foundries or machine workers, boot and shoe workers, locomotive workers, and way down at the bottom is the gravel, stone, and stone workers making or creating marble and stone. Its height was in 1860 when 118 people were earning their living doing that in town. So this was never a very large industry. The bottom half of this chart just shows the percentages as opposed to the raw numbers. I did some research with some of the Manchester city directories and compared 1881 and 1882, and I could only find 8 people in those 2 years employed at the ledge. So by 1882, the output of rock being taken out of Oak Hill had severely diminished. Well, stonemason Warren Harvey of Harvey Road fame was interviewed for an in-depth article called "The Stone Business: To What Extent It Is and Has Been Carried On." This was published in November 10th of 1888 in the Mirror and American. And it described a number of the active ledges in the Manchester area. You may be surprised exactly how many there were. Harvey said, "It's the best stone market in the state. There are probably taken from the quarries in and around Manchester every year 15,000 perch of stone." A perch is a unit of length. It's roughly equivalent to 1 rod, a square rod of land. These quarries alone furnish 10,000 perch. Nearly all is used here at home, very little being sent out of the city. The 3 largest quarries are those operated by the Amoskeag Company, by Frank S. Bodwell, and myself. I lease and operate what is known as the Kennard Ledge, owned by Joseph F. Kennard. He also said that he was paid $3 to $5 per perch of stone laid, and $10 to $20 per load of stone for higher dimension use. The article said the Clark Ledge on North River Road provided a large quantity of foundation and building stone until the discovery of the Kennard Ledge. And Harvey lists a number of other ledges around town, including the one at Rock Rimmon, which was an active quarry for granite for mills on the west side. More of the ledges around Manchester. In that 1888 article, Harvey concludes by saying the Kennard, Bodwell, and Amoskeag ledges have been in operation for about 18 or 20 years, and most of the best granite used in the city is found and taken here. A year ago, meaning 1887, the Amoskeag, having exhausted its supply, purchased 60 feet off of the Kennard ledge. So clearly by 1887, the useful life of the Amoskeag ledge was coming to an end. Around that time, other developments were happening in the neighborhood. 1890 is when Delafield Park was laid out by a design from Alderman Lucian Clough, who was actually one of the founders of and one of the movers behind the original Manchester Institute of Art. He created the design for it on 68 acres of city land, formerly used as the city farm. By 1910, it had expanded to 90 acres due to annexation of some land up on Oak Hill itself, and the land purchased from the Amoskeag Company for their new reservoir. Manchester Waterworks opened their first high-service reservoir in 1894, and it would be just above the top of this map out of the picture. And the newer reservoir that's up there as well today was named for J. Brodie Smith, and that was built between 1933 and 35 as a Works Progress Administration project under the Roosevelt administration. Notice how fancy the original design for Delafield was. This was long before they envisioned playing fields for kids. These were all roads for a horse and carriage and horse and buggy. You see over on the left-hand edge, a large pond was intended. Part of that was functional because the water table in this whole area at Oak Hill is quite high. Doesn't take much to tap into water, which was partly the demise of the quarry itself. That land that you see where the pond was supposed to be is about where Hillside Junior High is today. And right at the end of their parking area, on the downhill slant of Delafield Park, there's a very marshy area. It's quite wet most of the year. Well, that's why, because the water table is very high right there. You'll also notice a lot of trees and plantings up here. So Delafield Park was meant to be a wonderful thing, but as usual, the city ran out of money. Well, if you've been up to Oak Hill, you've probably been to the Weston Observatory, which was built in 1890 as a memorial to the former mayor of Manchester and governor of New Hampshire, James Adams Weston. He left $5,000 in his will to build this structure for the enjoyment of the citizenry, and it was meant to be used for scientific and recreational pursuits. They dedicated it in 1896, and that was during the city's 50th anniversary. The summit is 537 feet above sea level, and that makes it the second highest point in the city next to Bald Hill. It brought 16,000 visitors up here in its first year. You notice there's no gating or anything there. Today, of course, if they didn't have a gate on it, the vandals would take it apart, which they nearly did in the 1960s, and we'll talk about that later. The Weston is made of granite, but it did not come out of the quarry, which was just out of the picture into the woods to my right, your left. That granite was actually taken from Hooksett as well. During World War II, this was used as a spotting tower to look for enemy aircraft. Though, as far as we know, there never were any spotted. There's another stone tower in Manchester. Anybody know where it is?
VA.
Yes, at the VA Medical Center. This is the Smith Tower. It's considerably smaller. It's only 40 feet high, and it was built by former governor and former mayor Frederick K. Smith in 1882. He and Adams Weston were the only two people ever to serve both as mayor of Manchester and governor of New Hampshire. That was built on private Smith land, and they used it for recreational purposes. And today, unfortunately, it's been allowed to pretty much deteriorate. Even though both of these are on the National Register of Historic Places, the Smith Tower is no longer open to the public and is simply being used by the VA for storage. Also on top of the hill, and you see it in proximity to the Weston Observatory, is the larger of the two reservoirs. This was long before it was covered over like it is today with a tarpaulin. This was an well, actually, this was not the first reservoir in the city. Does anybody know where the first reservoir was? Where? No, not the one that's down off of Mammoth and Caliph, or in that area? But no, that came later.
Brook Street.
Yes, it was off of Brook Street. It was bounded by Harrison, Russell, Oak, and Gore Street. I believe Gore Street is now what's known as Mirror Street. It's up in the north end of town, and it was a 2 square block area that was an artificial reservoir the Amoskeag created, not for drinking water, but it was meant as a fire prevention tool. They pumped river water up from the Merrimack and stored it in this 11 million gallon tank, basically, in case they had fires at that end of town. You have to remember that at that time, that was the end of town. Things didn't extend much past Webster Street at that point. The Amoskeag Company filled that reservoir eventually, and now today it's all houses. I wonder if people flood there in the wet season. The city's municipal reservoirs up here on Oak Hill were adjacent to the park. The high service reservoir was opened in 1894. The second one came later. One had a storage capacity of 17 million gallons, and the other had about 4 million gallons. To give you an idea where they are in proximity to each other, this is an aerial shot from the 1940s, shows you the tower. There used to be a small pavilion across the parking lot from it. Also notice that the road that today is the cross-country track path up there, that was not the main road up to the tower. The main road actually came down here, and you'll see that a little more clearly in the next image. So we're talking about the ledge being off here. One reservoir is here, and the other is just out of the picture. And to put that into better context, you see the two reservoirs, and the main road up there for the horses and buggies was down through here and disappeared off into the woodwork. This is that same picture you just saw taken from a different angle. This is the reservoir that now faces west, and that's the ledge beyond it, just a short path into the woods. The Manchester Mirror and American, in fact, the roads that you see, Skyview Road would be up here and up straight, and this other road that's on the left-hand margin, that's High Range Road, and today it's all built up with residences wall to wall. Those properties come quite close to the western edge of the granite wall from this holding tank. Incidentally, today this reservoir is totally enclosed in a tank that was put into the 1960s under EPA rules. Mm-hmm.
Can you point out where Deerfield Park is?
Yeah, Deerfield Park would be due south, right at the bottom of the picture. And if you were to come down High Range Road right out of the picture, that was the backyard and the parking area of the middle school today. So that would be just below this, out of the range of the picture. So this was the ledge. You're on the east and you're looking west off in the distance. You're not quite looking at the Monadnocks. They'd be just off to the left. The high end where that tree was you saw in the video would be over here on your left. In fact, that might be the branches of it that you see sticking out. And you get some idea as to what this looked like when it was a granite mining operation. You can see the huge hole where the water is. That was all solid rock from cliff to cliff at one time. And if you look really carefully, that's the diving platform that these swimmers used to go off of. We have an article from the Manchester Mirror on March 30th, 1882 that said the Amoskeag Corporation will not work its ledge in the northeastern part of the city this season, it having been deemed impractical to continue further excavating. The company has a large amount of stone on hand that was taken out last year, both from the ledge in question and from the one near Rock Rimmon. As a result, no more is needed at present and may not be demanded at all, as it is the policy of the agent to make the present season a quiet one in the building line. which meant the economy had slowed down. They weren't building new mills. There's two theories on the flood which ended this area's life as a rock quarry and turned it into a swimming hole. One of those theories is that in 1883, the year after that article was published, a blasting operation caused a large explosion in the west wall, and it opened springs that were attached to the water table in that area and caused the pit to spontaneously flood. One story says that the quarry filled so fast that the workers had to leave their excavated tools behind. There's another version that was detailed in a front page Evening Leader Morning Union story in June of 1929, but this story had been written many years after the fact. It quoted city surveyor Daniel Cronin as saying he was a stone cutter at the ledge in 1889, not 1883. When workers arrived one day and found a small amount of water, by nightfall it was 15 inches deep. When they came the next day, the quarry was filled with 15 to 18 feet of water. But that version of the story makes no reference to a particular flood. I've spent a lot of time over the years looking through old newspapers to try to pin this down and get a more specific date. Haven't found anything. I have to remember that in those days, 1882 to 1889, the only media that existed locally was the newspapers. This was long before radio and television. And this was also private property. So what happened on Amoskeag property might not necessarily have made it into the common news because it would have been considered nobody else's business but the company's. And since there was such a small number of people working there anyway, the impact on people would have been quite minimal. We've not found any stories that indicated there was a loss of life connected with this flooding. But clearly by 1889, this was no longer usable for rock. And this is a close-up of that same image. You see the diving platform over here in the lower right. And here you see a lean-to, a few tree branches piled together. Craig, this would have been something your kids could have camped under. This was a very primitive shelter, and the earliest members of the Brownies used that. You also see a road, well, not a road, a path that disappears into the woods because there were no formal paved roads to get up here. So it was in, whoops, what happened there? That's not what we wanted. Hang on a second. It certainly did. Let's try that. So in 1922, Daniel P. Kennard organized the Brownies. He was kind of the informal coach. He lived not too far from the area himself, and he used to ride his horse to get up there. He believed in not weekly, but daily outdoor swimming year-round. And he used the ledge to attract these boys who were the first members. You see some girls in the next picture here, but they were not initially part of the group. The first Brownies were exclusively boys for the first season. And the girls demanded equal time, and they finally got it. So the next year they were admitted. But as John said in the video, the Super Brownies opened in 1925. And you had to swim outdoors every day, 365 days consecutively to qualify as a Super Brownie. And many people did. This picture was taken on Halloween night of 1923. You see Dan Kennard over towards the left. He's the second person in wearing the white top and the dark bathing costume. They had a bonfire going, and the sign says, City of Rocks, Halloween, October 31st, 1923. One of the earliest articles I found about the Brownies was published by the Boston Sunday Globe in January of 1923. And it includes this photo montage that they doctored together. That could very well have been Ted Leaf, John's grandfather, up there diving off the rocks, or it could have been any one of the members. What they said, though, several times in this article, they didn't like calling them Brownies. Because remember, there was the L Street Brownies who used to dive every New Year's Day in Boston. They repeatedly referred to them as the Quarry Kids in this Boston Globe article. It referred to a primitive lean-to near water's edge, covered with tree boughs and about a foot of snow. The end facing the pond was open. Pieces of brush constituted a fire that was more smoke than flame. It described how the swimmers, all young boys, went to the lean-to, stripped and pulled on light bathing suits. There were no bathrobes. There was not even a towel. Picture the sheer wall of a quarry cliff. A half-naked boy posed on a piece of bagging to keep from slipping on the ice or snow. Then the graceful plunge and the shower of spray as his body cuts the ice-framed pool of black water. So you see the diving platform over here. This would have been a very rude and crude hole that they literally carved out of ice using ice cutters and shovels and picks. And the lean-to is right back here. This is the well-appointed changing lean-to. Obviously, once girls came into the picture, they said this was not sufficient, so they decided they were going to have to build a building, which they did. You see some of the earliest members with the lean-to, and these two insets on the ends are Harold Eastman, who for many years was the treasurer and the manager of the Brownies as an organization. He was sort of Dan Connor's right-hand man. This photo was taken November 2nd, 1924, and obviously it's mostly older members of the group. Eastman is the third one in from the right. And finally, this picture shows the construction of the small building that they made, which had a pot-bellied stove in it and provided some heat for changing, and it also served as a first aid station when necessary, which surprisingly was not very often, given the danger of what they were doing. So there you see the finished cabin, and you see the diving platform, and this is obviously in decent weather because there's snow missing. There is no snow here. This is the same building at a slightly different time, slightly better resolution photo. You also get the natural grade of the land, how it angled down towards Belmont Street. So the higher end was on the Mammoth Road side. And this is the same shack taken from a different vantage point, showing the diving platform in the foreground. And in the back, you can see there's a ladder perched up against the cliff. This was one of the lower elevation dive points that people used to go off into the water.
Did the Amoskeag company protest this at all? I mean, since it was very publicly known, obviously if it's in the Sunday paper, they know that it's being used and that they're constructing, I mean, did they?
They protested a lot, and we'll talk about that because that's a recurring theme. This was land that was still owned by the Amoskeag company. The city did not own this part of it. They had deeded the Darrowfield Park and the land where Weston was to the city and specifically to Waterworks. But this land where the ledge was still owned by the Amoskeag company. And this is going to become a recurring theme about, is it safe, is it not? So here's yet another picture showing the ladders purchased up against the cliff. So they would dig out these various holes. Somebody wisely put a danger sign because spectators would come up. Not everybody was crazy enough to jump off the cliffs, but a lot of spectators would come. And they would just walk out blindly onto the ice, not knowing that there was danger to them. You saw in the video several pictures of the dog, and I think it's probably the same dog that you see over here. Now you're looking basically toward the south, or maybe the southeast to be more specific, and again you get the idea of the angled elevation. And you see a bunch of swimmers. This was Valentine's Day, 1925, 11 members of the Brownies. And I like to say the only smart one in that picture was the dog, because he wasn't in there. So people used to come in many ways. You wonder, how did they get to the ledge? This was all before, well, by this time cars existed, but there were no roads, so it would have been fairly difficult to get a car here. Many of them walked, but also it was pretty common to use horseback, like this member who used to ride. There was a trolley line that went up Bridge Street, almost all the way to Darrowfield Park, but it stopped, and you would have had to make the rest of the walk in by foot. Still other people came by buckboard, and I love that picture. It's like, let's get Grandma out of the house for the day. We'll go up and watch those nut jobs jumping into the water from the cliffs. And come they did. The Brownies used to put on 4 public exhibitions per year, one for each season. And they used to attract huge crowds. We have newspaper accounts where there was as many as 15,000 people ringed the quarry ledge to look down and watch the shows. And they would put on silly costumes and put little skits together, and then they would have the high diving events. So there were an awful lot of people that came here. I particularly like this shot because it shows you the diving platform on the foreground, but it looks across to the top. That tree that you see is it's the tree. It's the one from which the 130-foot dives were made, and that's on the southern cliff. And you get an idea how much rock had been taken out of there to create this basin. So this was a pretty substantial quarry at one time. And these kids were apparently pretty much impervious to all sorts of weather. September 1923, the Union leader. Ledge patrons are learning self-control and unusual stunts under instruction. This summer saw several changes at the ledge, including the advent of girls as regular attendants at the pool. In the past, boys had insisted on having the ledge as their own swimming hole and had banned members of the fairer sex from the sanctum of their activities. But liberation came in 1923. In more than one way, this was Catherine Flanders, and I found this picture online one time on a She was the pinup girl for a particular month in a calendar of 1926. A motorcycle manufacturer like a Harley Davidson or an Indian produced a yearly calendar, and they made her their girl for the month, this particular month. The Flanders, you saw one of her sisters, I think it was Helen in the video. Their mother was Bertie Flanders, and there were 3 sisters, and they were the largest family component of the Brownies, though there were several brothers and sisters who were Brownies, and later on there were at least 2 marriages that we know of. This woman you also saw in the video, this was Leona Sullivan Cousins. She met her husband Keith Cousins, and they married through the Brownies. This picture was New Year's Eve 1924 and 25. We don't know who the 2 men in the middle were, the 2 tall guys, but Harold Eastman over here again on the right, and several other members. Lester DeRost, Marion Harland, Miss Bramhall, and Joe McBride. This sequence is believed to be from one of the Brownies' New Year's Eve shows. It shows just how cold the air temperature must have been, but it never stopped the show. They would have New Year's Eve spectaculars, and thousands of people would go up there in the dark carrying lanterns to watch these shows. And like the lady said in the video, you know, we were warm, we were circulating our blood, standing there. Those are the people that were cold. So look at the crowd, and look at how people used to perch on the edges of these cliffs. It was more dangerous for the spectators than it ever was for the divers. The crowd sizes were really huge. And this is one of the, that might be Ted Leaf as well. You notice there are spotters down at the bottom, and those big chunks are not granite rock. That's ice that they have pulled out to make something a hole into which the divers could dive.
You found that photo in the Miami News.
Yes, exactly. This was also published just a couple of years ago in Yankee Magazine, but this was a very common, this was in Chicago Tribune, the Saskatchewan Daily Free Press. This published photo was all over the place. This is an enlargement of the one on the left. So you see the 2 spotters or the 2 divers getting ready to go out on the board, and then down at the bottom you see the spotters looking up just there in case there's any danger. Oh, and there goes Ted. Now think of how easy it would have been for somebody to jostle somebody or for somebody to slip on ice, because on the opposite cliff you see there's still ice into the cliff, so this is still winter. How easy would it have been for a real mass casualty incident to happen? And this is why the Amoskeag company was really concerned. They were aware that there was an insurance liability issue here, and they didn't want to be caught in the middle of it. Incidentally, the jumper here is Myron Walker, and Helen Flanders is the young lady down here in the very lower right-hand corner. These are photos from the Winter Carnival in 1927, which I think was in February that year. They used to tie it in with the rest of the Winter Carnival that the city sponsored. It shows you the number of newsreel photographers who came literally from all over the world. They weren't just US, they came from Paris, they came from Germany, they came from London, because they wanted to get pictures of these people. And you see somebody getting ready to do a backwards dive off the board, but look at the crowd and how thick it was behind them. You see another diver queuing up, getting ready to go. Massive crowds. And the holes that they were diving into were not that deep and were not that big. There is another piece of newsreel photography which we don't have to show you, but we can show you these stills that came from British Pathé. They shot it in January of 1927, and it's called 4 Degrees Below Zero, Men and Women and Children at the Manchester Brownies Club enjoying their morning dip. A group of swimmers in matching vested costumes stand near some water with snow and ice everywhere. Some dive and jump in. They must be mad. There are slow motion shots of people jumping in. One makes a perfect dive from a platform on a cliff with the icy landscape in the background. A second diver does a handstand on the board and also dives in. The group pose together laughing. One puts a huge block of ice down his vest, while another pretends to drink from another block of ice. We contacted British Pathé several years ago when we first did this show and said, gee, we'd sure like to have a copy of this to show in our museum. And they said, $500 American, please. So we haven't done that. If anybody would like to make that donation, we'd be happy to acquire the photo. But unfortunately, under the terms of the licensing, we would not have been allowed to show that unlimited times. We could have had it in the museum, but we could not have circulated it. So we figured, what's the point? Well, cameramen came from all these big news services, and this particular shot was from January of 1923. Boys dive from cliff to icy pool for movies. This was a very well-documented article, and it talks about Richard Henry Roy, who's being helped out of the water by Coach Dan Connor. It says, while floating on a cake of ice 2 feet thick, 14-year-old Richard Henry Roy lost his balance and clothes and all tumbled into the water, but unexcitedly swam towards the edge of the pool and was dragged out, none the worse for his experience. We have never found a documented incident where there was a serious injury involving members of the Brownies group because Connor and Eastman insisted on certain safety procedures. We have documented a number of other instances in which people drowned in the ledge pool, but this was long after the Brownies went out of business. It's interesting, too, because there was a photo that was shot somewhere in the mid-20s, early 20s, and the Chamber of Commerce used this image in a 1925 promotional brochure for the city. And Dick Duckoff, who was one of our trustees here at the Historic Association, is quite a collector. He came up with a color postcard, which evidently had been based on this photo, and here it was. So it's now New Year's Eve, 1926, and we've got the Brownies. A note on their bathing costumes. Some of the early Brownie members thought that they were brown with white lettering, which would make sense with their name, the Brownies. But at some point, we know Manchester Knitted Fashions donated a new set of swimming costumes to the whole group, and they were described in the paper as being bright red with white lettering. So we don't really know. We've never actually been given one of those sets of clothing to put in our collection. February 21st, 1930, Super Brownies in costume. We have a close-up shot over here on the left of Keith Cousins, 108 feet in the air. The deal was this tree stood highest on the south cliff, and it wasn't a very substantial tree, but it was quite tall. So somebody put a ladder there, and they built this little platform from which they would dive. It looks very flimsy, and it was. And picture a day like today with the wind as gusty as it was last night and as gusty as it's supposed to be today. On Saturday, February 21st, 1925, Keith Cousins and Robert Enright both achieved dives of 108 feet at the Winter Carnival in front of throngs of people. Thousands of spectators gathered to also see Francis Moquin do the same dive in 1926. Mayor and Mrs. Arthur Morrow were on hand to present trophies to the best divers. October 13th, 1928, a fall carnival. Frank Provo, Keith Cousins, and Esmond Bill Mannion all made the 108-foot dive in front of the newsreel photographers from Fox Movietone, International News, British Pathé, Metro Goldwyn Mayer, and Paramount, all on hand. And I know that there are, I believe there are some relatives of the Mannions here today. One in the very back. I'd like to say hello, and another one a little closer up. Thank you for coming today. We want to talk to you guys later today. So you see how dangerous this was. These pictures all show the same tree, and the far left, somebody has just left the diving platform, is on his way down. I like these photos because they show a particular scar on the granite wall, which is still visible today somewhat. This jagged scar, it's a good landmark for placing these pictures and to figure out what vantage point they were shot from. And yet, here's another one, and look at the crowd up there. Just think, if somebody had accidentally pushed or lost their balance or dropped something and leaned forward to get it, you might jostle somebody else, and pretty soon you've got a major disaster. And the Amoskeag Company is wringing its hands downtown. On this photo, I've highlighted where the diver is. He left the platform some time ago. You also have a couple of spotters down at the bottom. And you've got one intrepid spectator who crawled out on the side of a cliff there just to kind of have a fun place to hang out. So here's the photo that John talked about, and this is Ted Leaf down here in the corner. This is what he has on his wall in the office here. And Ted was apparently the poster child because lots of pictures of him appeared in a lot of newspapers around the country. And I know there's a number of members of John's extended family and Leaf descendants here today. There we go. So they're all kind of clustered in the back. We have bathing suits ready for you. We'll be getting the bus shortly. Here was a spectacular event. 108-foot dive, blindfolded, a feature of the Brownies Carnival. Esmond Bill Mannion startled the throng. First, there were just 60-foot dives by clowns included in the stunts at their spring carnival. This was actually on St. Patrick's Day of 1929. Mannion climbed the ladder to the top of the pine tree. He put on a blindfold and safely dove 108 feet at an estimated 80 miles an hour. Mannion, incidentally, survived all this because he met his wife, Irene Demers, who was another Brownies member, and they eventually were married. The same day, Frank Provo jumped from the same height, but he did not wear the blindfold. February 23rd of 1930, Frank Provo set what could have been the all-time dive of 132 feet. The previous tree had been cut down, so a local contractor came in and built a scaffold from which the diving could occur, and it was actually 2 feet higher than the previous level. So he actually made it safely 132 feet into the water. In addition to the 108-foot treetop, Brownies regularly jump from predetermined heights of 66, 55, and 21 feet. Francis Moquin was the first of the trio to be lowered by rope over the side of the cliff in February of 1927. The event was delayed some time while the thin covering of ice formed, since the thick blocks of ice had been cut off, had to be skimmed off the surface. So as soon as they would cut it, it would freeze up again. A spectacular stunt was presented by Robert Enright when he jumped from the south rim of the ledge 80 feet above the surface of the water. Then, to help thrill the crowd, he performed a remarkable feat when he ran off the edge and cleared more than 10 feet of rock, landing in the water. This was warmer weather because the spectators are dressed in more casual clothing. This is taken at the south end of the ledge, actually at the west end of the ledge. This would be closest to the Belmont Street end of things. But still, massive crowds coming out to see this. They would put on summer calisthenics shows. In this picture I like because you see the first automobiles, lots of them, found their way through the woods to get up here. You also see some cooking fires, so people were bringing lunches and having barbecues and tailgating early on. There was no football played as far as we know. But this diving platform is a constant of all these pictures because that never moved during all these years. Well, the question that was asked earlier about what did the Amoskeag company think about all this? They weren't happy with it, and they were afraid there was going to be a mass incident someday. So at one point, they called to fill in the ledge. September 15th, 1921, the city announces it's going to fill the ledge in at the request of the Amoskeag. This will once and for all put an end to a nuisance against which the Manchester Mirror and the Manchester public have been crying since the beginning of last summer. It will rid that section of the city of offensive odors emanating from the stagnant water hole, which proved to be a culture of mosquitoes. That actually was a manufactured complaint because this was spring-fed and was natural water and it never got stagnant, so there really was no odor coming out of it. This article, January 13th, 1923, about 800 people gathered for Manchester's first winter carnival. 11 people plunged into 20 feet of water when the thin ice they were standing on gave way, dumping them through a hole 6 by 10 feet. No one was killed. The victims were taken to the nearest home on Mammoth Road to await medical attention. And fortunately, nobody was seriously injured. But by 1921, by 1923, clearly the Amoskeag company was trying to figure out a way out to keep people out of this area. And then a drowning, June 18th of 1923. Arthur Duval, a 14-year-old who lived on Elm Street, drowned while swimming with 3 companions. He was halfway across the 100-foot-wide body of water when he gasped, called for help, and went under. Ironically, Dan Kennard, the coach, had been at the scene. He was there when it happened, but he had just was recovering from a broken leg and was unable to jump into the water. The broken leg was not related to his diving activities. Duval's body was recovered several hours later. So Frederick Dumaine was the Amoskeag company's agent. He was the chief guy at that time in town. And Dumaine acted on an appeal of police for safety first, saying that the lease of the ledge from the Amoskeag company would not be renewed for the Manchester Brownies that coming season. They'd been there since 1922 to 1930, but the Amoskeag company was not going to renew their $1 per year license to use the area. Police Chief Walter Healy padlocked the area and was quoted as saying that eventually a catastrophe was bound to occur at carnival time and that all the police officers in the city couldn't prevent it if they were on guard. Well, of course, what do you do when there's a fence and you're a kid? So the area never totally closed, at least not at this point, to swimming. People would break in and people would sneak in and they would still use the area, but there were going to be no more of these shows that attracted thousands of people. By early 1932, the Brownies had actually relocated to Pine Island Pond, and they lasted there for another 2 years. They disbanded after the 1934 season. And you see this picture, a plunge in icy waters, their New Year's Eve celebration, members of the Brownies Club celebrating the coming new year at Pine Island Park, New Hampshire. Looks like they're playing checkers or something, or maybe cards or something. So these are the documented members of the Brownies that we know about. When I did this show first, I think 5 or 6 years ago, we only had 3 columns worth of names. And clearly, every time we do the show and go someplace to present it, we find out about new people. So the list has grown considerably. How many of you recognize at least one name on that list of somebody that you knew or were related to? Many hands are going up. So there were a lot of people. Incidentally, I have another article from February of 1930. This was one of the last reasons that the Amoskeag Company decided to close the area. The headline was, "High diver misses ice by few inches, narrowly escapes injury in 132-foot plunge." Frank Provo, a prominent high diver of the Manchester Super Brownies, narrowly escaped injury when he was caught by wind during a 32-foot dive. Provo's presence of mind to turn quickly in the air caused him to head for the water. Lack of sufficient police to handle the huge crowd caused a delay in the program, and considerable fear was felt for the safety of the throng as hundreds pushed out onto the ice and crawled out onto the shelves of ledge. So that was it. The company and the city said, "We've had it, we don't want swimmers." And very shortly afterwards, in 1930, the Amoskeag Company actually deeded the land to the city for a future reservoir property. So this is really the next part of the show, which talks about some of the disasters, but none of these were Brownie related. The first documented drowning was actually in the ledge in 1895, long before the Brownies had even started. 12-year-old Sammy Levine, who lived nearby on Russell Street, he was an Ash Street school student. He and 3 other boys went to bathe around 1 o'clock in the afternoon on a September afternoon. He reportedly lost his footing and fell in. The other boys ran back to Levine's home to notify parents. In 1895, telephones were just coming in. The family might not have even had one. By the time they raised the alarm and got help, the boy had drowned. The Mirror reported that the Amoskeag Company plans to pump out all the water in the hole this afternoon in order that the body can be recovered as early as possible. Well, you saw how deep that was. They had 2 city fire pumpers, probably 2 Amoskeag steam engines, pumping continually for 48 hours and hardly dented it because it was spring-fed. As fast as they pumped it out, the water replenished. Eventually, they called the National Guard battery, who brought in a cannon that fired it several times into the water in hopes that the concussion of sound might loosen Sammy, who they thought was probably trapped under an outcropping of rock. The body was eventually recovered 4 days after his drowning, and he was buried in Pelham. This tragedy had additional consequences 9 months later because Sammy's mother, Etta Levine, was so distraught over her son's death that she took her own life. One morning, as her husband left for work, she went into their barn and hung herself, and they found her at the end of the day. She was so distressed about the death of her son. On July 15th of 1907, 8-year-old Xavier Champagne of Pearl Street disappeared. He and 2 companions had been walking on the east side, and they became disoriented about exactly where they were. Near Darrowfield Park, they headed down Bridge Street, but Xavier was last seen heading north through the woods. First, they searched Stevens Pond unsuccessfully. Then the boys said, well, maybe we weren't at Stevens Pond. We might have been closer to the ledge. Eventually, divers were brought in, and they recovered. His body was actually never located. But divers that went into the pool did recover tools and pieces of old cable that had been left at the bottom. So that earlier theory that perhaps there had been something of a rapid flood may have been true. So we've documented a number of these drownings over the years. I'm a little behind my pictures. There's 11 cases of people we know who drowned. 10-year-old Roland Buford, July 30th, 1933, after the city and the company had closed the ledge. He'd been swimming with his 2 sisters who said he was afraid of water. They got ready to leave. They couldn't find him. It took more than a month to find his body. May 1946, a 44-year-old Navy veteran and postal employee disappeared. He apparently had drowned. Eventually, they identified him when they pulled the body out by the clothing and personal effects he carried. January 1950, the body of a retired bus driver, Cornelius Murphy, was found. He'd been missing for 2 months. That death ruled accidental drowning. December 1955, 16-year-old James Scully, an Orange Street resident who went to Bishop Bradley nearby. The story was that he had gone out on the ice during lunch break to see if the ice was thick enough for he and his buddies to play hockey after school. It wasn't. He drowned. That body was never recovered. June 18, 1929, Hector Bover, 8 years old, goes missing. His clothes found on a pile of rock on the west side of the ledge. This photo shows a police diver preparing to drag from a rowboat. We also had some bizarre instances of cars being dumped into the ledge over time. We know of at least 2 vehicles that were pulled out of there. Dr. Frank Warren was a North End dentist. His car was stolen in February 1928. And when they found it about a year later, they said that the car was in fairly good condition. His touring car suffered in the watery grave somewhat, but the machine was still in gear. The key was still in the ignition lock. 3 tires were in good condition, filled with air. The radiator was filled with water, but the odor of alcohol placed in it for the winter of 1928 remains. And the ledge has continued to be a dumping grounds for stuff even today. So the city decides it's going to build a new reservoir. You see up at the top of this diagram the ledge pool. This was the part formerly owned by the Amoskeag company where the Brownies operated. But this part was all owned by the Kennard family, specifically Nora Kennard Jones. You also see the layout of the new 1930s era reservoir and the existing one from the 1890s. In 1958, well, this just shows Nora K. Jones' land. This was all her property up in the upper corner here. This shot appeared in the Union Leader. Some of you may remember George Naum, longtime Union Leader photographer, who took this image in June 1958. Diving off 55, Frank Harlan of 633 Auburn Street kept cool yesterday despite the fact the mercury had shot up into the high 80s. He's pictured about to hit the water following a dive from 55. So clearly in the late 1950s, people were still using this, even though the company and the city had tried time after time to keep people out by posting signs. But they hadn't posted fencing all the way around the place because it was considered to be prohibitively costly. In 1963, the Manchester Waterworks had about an acre of land up there, and they determined that the water was, or the pond proper was about 270 by 150 feet, and it was about 45 and a half feet maximum depth. So that's how big the pond was at that point. July 1982, the beginning of the last straw. 26-year-old William Murphy of Sagamore Street drowned while swimming with friends. Police were called at 1:15 in the morning. The body wasn't found until 9 days later. The following summer, June of 1983, 19-year-old Gary J. Victorin drowned while swimming in the ledge just a week after graduating from Central High School, and the alderman said, "That's it." Under Mayor Emil Bolya, they appropriated money to install $30,000 of chain link fence all the way around the perimeter of the ledge property. And inside it, just to discourage people from hopping the chain link fence, they put very sharp razor wire, which is still there today and has had all these years of rust on it and would do a real number on you. You'd want to have your tetanus boosters before you sneak in there today. The next part of this is the Kennard family and the role they played. The Kennards were prominent. They came from Litchfield originally, but the brothers were all very prominent business people in the late 19th century. And the genealogy was that John, Diamond, Samuel, James, and Joseph all became extremely wealthy, mostly in the lumbering business. They chopped down trees and floated them down the Merrimack River to markets in Massachusetts and made fortunes with this. This is one of the homes of the Kennards. This one was on Beach Street, number 609. It's where Diamond and Angeline Kennard lived. In the 1870 census, he owned $25,000 worth of real estate and $10,000 more in personal estate. In 1870 money, that was pretty wealthy. James and Martha Kennard had no kids. He was associated with his brothers in the lumbering business. He also had a large fortune. He lived on 132 Bridge Street. And John Fogg Kennard owned this house, which was also near the corner of Beach and Bridge Streets. He was the oldest of the 7 siblings. This home stayed in the family till the early 1930s, and in 1939 they sold it to the Currier Gallery of Art to use as an art school. It wasn't at Bridge and Beach originally. It was actually over near probably, I'm trying to get my bearings, Walnut and Ash Streets, or somewhere in that area, in between those blocks, very close to the Currier building. This picture was Susan Strickler, the former executive director at the Currier. In June 2005, they moved that building from the Currier property over to a building at the corner of, or a building lot at the corner of, bounded by Orange, Walnut, Pearl, and Beach Streets. And that building is the administrative offices for the Currier today. So this was a pretty well-off family, and Nora Kennard Jones was a daughter, was the only child, in fact, of Joseph and Rebecca Tufts. And she married Edwin Jones, who was a very prominent man in town. We'll talk about Jones in a minute. You probably have heard of the Kennard building or the Kennard block that was downtown. It was on, John, you may need to help me, I think on the area where Hampshire Plaza or the Brady Sullivan Tower is now.
Exactly, yes.
And it was the building of the day for its business provisions. It was built as a real palace. It was where every business that was somebody or wanted to be somebody wanted to be located in this multi-story building. They laid the foundation in 1893. The building was supposed to be made of Berea sandstone from Ohio. The southeast corner of the building was equipped with the finest banking rooms in New Hampshire, and there were safety deposit vaults unlike any others in the state. They had worked out a deal with the New Hampshire Trust Company for rent at $8,000 per year for 50 years, after which the building would revert to ownership by the family. And in its heyday, that's what it looked like. A multi-story building, occupied pretty much an entire block, and it was a Cadillac. The Kennard stood as a symbol of the Queen City's prosperity until fire destroyed it in January 1902. So it didn't have a very long lifestyle. You see this montage of pictures as to how bad the damage was. It destroyed the whole block and the nearby Darafield Club. Some tenants were able to salvage some important business documents from those safes and vaults. There was a first-floor clothing business that recovered all of its merchandise, and while it was damaged by smoke and water, none of it burned because the fire was confined mostly to the upper floors until they caved in on themselves. Well, the wreckage and debris took a while to clear away, and then there was the insurance settlement, but the Kennard family did rebuild a much more modest building on the same footprint. January 1972, however, this building was torn down as part of the city's redevelopment to make room for the Hampshire Plaza, or today Brady Sullivan Tower. So the Kennard family was pretty prominent. This is the obituary of Joseph Kennard. This was in 1892, and at the time of his death, he owned a number of substantial tracts of land in addition to his cash properties, including, as you see up here, Mammoth Road, 43 acres. And that portion, although they said it was located on Mammoth Road, extended back almost to Smith Road and included the area up where the ledge was. When he died, this land was willed to his only daughter, Nora K. Jones, who by this time had married attorney Frank Jones. And you can see that her uncle, John Kennard, had 16 acres. She had 19 acres. Her other uncle, Samuel, had 8 acres. So they owned a chunk of land, all adjoining property that the Amoskeag Company owned. And every time the Amoskeag or the city said, we want to close the ledge to public swimming, she would say, well, I don't, and I own half that land. I own half the pond is on my property. And you can't very well build a chain link fence across the middle of a pond. So every time the city tried to close it, she would keep it open, saying, I don't want a fence built there. Edwin Jones was a very prominent citizen in his time. You see many of his credentials here. He died very early. He was probably a victim of the influenza epidemic in 1918 because he died in October of that year. His cause of death didn't say the Spanish flu, but that was what was going through town and decimating people. He was only 59 years at death. He and Nora had only one child, and she died in infancy. So Nora was a very wealthy widow, and she lived on East High Street. I believe the 10 law offices are located there today. She lived a very quiet but dignified upper-class life. She belonged to some organizations, but she was never very flashy in philanthropy. She was not a very visible person on the city's social scene. They used to spend a lot of time in their Seacoast home in the summer. They had a place in Hampton. A Union Leader article in July of 1947 said, swimming at the ledge called traditional. And it said, early opposition to the place met with little success because part of the land was owned by the Kennards, who favored the use of the pool for swimming. It was then proposed by city officials to use the lodge as a city dump. A past owner of the property, Nora K. Jones, threatened legal action to stop any such use of the ledge, so the city officials backed down. Nora died in 1937, and she left her attorney, Alan Wilson, to execute her estate. It totaled $237,000 plus at that time in 1937. Depression time, that was a lot of money. Among her gifts, 654 shares of 15 various stocks to Dartmouth College, which was her husband's alma mater. Nora was very generous to a number of relatives and distant cousins and friends. One cousin got $10,000. Another cousin who lived in Ohio got $8,000. She left several generous bequests to other local residents, and the people who had been her servants in the last years of her life also did very well by her will. She put $10,000 in trust for Miss Hilma Keller. another $25,000 in trust each for George Jones and Eulalie Arsenault, who had been her servants and live-in attendants. She also left an interesting will that directed her executors to dispose of all my jewelry, household goods, furniture, and furnishings not disposed of in specific bequests at a private sale, avoiding an auction, and I direct that my jewelry shall be disposed of by said executor in Boston. She didn't want local people seeing her stuff and pawing through it, so she directed that the auction be held out of state. It's my request that my executor endeavor to prevent the publication of these bequests and devises publicly, and to my knowledge, they never were. I give, bequeath, and devise all the rest, residue, and remainder of the estate, real, personal, and mixed, to the Direct Nursing Association of Manchester, which is the Visiting Nurse Association today, and trustees of the City Library of Manchester, to be equally divided. And she directed that her 19 acres of remaining land, almost 20 acres near the ledge, be divided equally in ownership between the library and the visiting nurse. So that's what happened, how the land got out of their control and was eventually sold back to the city. So Nora Jones was a very prominent person, and she, for many years, blocked the city from keeping the ledge off bounds. September 24th of 1969, the mayor and aldermen held a public hearing on whether or not to institute condemnation properties against 10 property owners who owned land between Kennard Road and Mammoth Road. It's the area you would now recognize as McIntyre Ski Area. They took that land by eminent domain in spite of objections from the property owners, who were eventually compensated. The city paid a fair amount of money for it, and in November of 1983, razor wire and chain link fence was put around the entire property. If you ski up at McIntyre, when you get off the top of the lift, you're very close to the ledge. If you look to your left, you'll see a chain link fence, and the ledge is right on the other side of it. So the property is still there. In 1985, the City Highway Department was tasked with filling in that gigantic basin, which they never succeeded in doing. They used some fill from Blueberry Hill on the west side near Gosler Park, and they leveled that hill and took all the remnants of tree stumps and dirt and leaves and dumped them in the ledge. Nothing, no dent at all. This shot was from Google Earth in 2011, and you can see the ledge area up in here. You can't see very much down into the pit anymore because there's now 35, 36 years worth of tree growth, which have grown up in the pit. There is still water in there. They never got rid of the water, though they did manage to tamp it down. But all the trees that took root there have sucked up the water. They use that for their nourishment. And the foliage cover now is so thick that you can stand on one cliff, the south cliff where the tree was, and look across to the north cliff, and you really can't see anything except treetops. This time of year you can see a little bit, but when the foliage is out, you really don't see anything at all. The basin is now full. That's the close-up of what the ledge looks like as of 2011, almost indistinguishable as anything. These pictures I took in 2013 or 14, I forget which. Might even have been 15. That's one of the two holes in the fence. There are ways that people get in there, and make no mistake, people do. There's graffiti all over the rocks, and you'll see some examples here in a minute. But there are ways to get in, and people still do. That's the top of the ski lift at McIntyre, and here's the fence, so it's that close. This is the other hole in the fence, incidentally. It's a very foreboding-looking area. You wouldn't want to climb that, but if you did and got inside, this is what it looks like. These were taken just the week of Thanksgiving. So there's no leaves on the trees, but you see how high these trees have grown. They're even taller than the cliff in some places. This would have been the south cliff where the divers dove from the tree into that pond below. You couldn't dive into that. Though when you stand up there and look down there, you see the remnants of tires and broken televisions and an occasional refrigerator and all manner of garbage bags. People go to some trouble to dump their waste up there. It's discouraging and amazing all at once. You can see that there was graffiti even in the 1960s on these rocks. So the graffiti is really nothing new. It must have been pretty interesting. How did you get out here to paint this up there and up there? But graffiti has always been part of the landscape here, so that's really nothing new. But this is what it looks like today. If you appreciate art, I guess this is kind of interesting. The taggers spent a lot of time, and it's a pretty hard area for police to get up to patrol, so they pretty much have their way with it. When we were up there a couple of years ago, 1 October, when the Historic Association opened the Weston Observatory for tours, Some people went into the woods and got smoking a little nasty stuff and set the woods on fire. And somebody down at McIntyre saw the smoke, called the fire department, and they came racing up from both directions. They sent up forest vehicles up the trail next to McIntyre, and they came up the road to the tower, and they arrested the people, charged them, not for smoking pot because the evidence was gone, but for setting the public fire on private property. Daniel P. Connor, founder of the Brownies, died in November of 1953. Harold Eastman died in November of 1970, 2 days after being struck and hit by a hit-and-run driver near his home at Amherst and Union Streets. He lived his entire life in Manchester and never married. There was no newspaper obituary. That concludes the formal part of our talk, but I'm wondering if the folks who are here today from descendants of the Mannion family brought pictures of or brought the gold Brownies ring with them. Why don't you come on up? I just learned of this. A gentleman named Frank Furco contacted me by email earlier this week. He lives in Chicago, and he had hoped to be here today, but his business wouldn't allow him to be here. But he said he had cousins in Manchester, all of whom were descended from Irene Demers and Bill Mannion, and you are one of them.
Right. I'm Bill Mannion.
The third, right?
The third. And this is an original Super Brownie ring from 1929. My grandfather has actually earned 3 of these.
Wow.
So before he died. I have a large number of family stories that are not in the slides, that some of the tragedies that happened after the Brownies, my grandfather was involved with. He actually lost his hearing as a result of trying to recover one of the victims. So it's a legacy that is well known in my family. We've very much enjoyed sitting around listening to the stories when he was alive. My father, Junior, is living in Myrtle Beach area, so he's still very much alive. He's just nice and retired and relaxing. So.
And this young lady, are you cousins?
No.
Nope.
How are you related?
We're not.
Oh, so you're not part of the family. So are you part of the Mannion family?
No, my dad's name was Larry Roy.
Okay.
I didn't see his name there.
Did you see Henry Roy? Was he related?
No.
Okay.
The thing is, he started at the ledge, and then when it was moved to Pine Island Park, that's when I got pictures of him. So I kind of went into his album and cut out some pictures.
That's great. We will be happy to add those to our collection.
You know, I don't know if some of these were from the ledge or not. But he was a Super Brownie. He's right here.
And that's a different, obviously you all can't see it, but he's wearing a white sweater with the Brownies logo, which is not the brown sweater, so that's yet a different variation on the costume that they would have.
Yeah. Well, I think he started when it was in 1931.
Yeah.
31. But I do have his brown.
Oh. That's what.
Oh, I got it.
That's the first one of those we've seen.
Oh, really? And I don't know where this one was taken.
That's Pine Island because there was no other buildings that close up at the ledge.
And this was Pine Island also.
Yeah.
They kind of did crazy little things.
Well, we're definitely going to want to talk to you after this, but thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And did you want to come up too?
Sure. So I am a descendant of Vira, Catherine, and Helen, and Bridget.
Right.
She was my grandmother.
Second one of these we've seen. In fact, I think this one's a little different than the one that the other lady had.
This one came from Mayor Monroe.
Yeah.
He actually created them and gave them to the Brownies at that time. I don't remember exactly.
Right.
I have the newspaper out here. This one,
There you go. The Flanders family was unusual because their mom took part, and she, by the photos, was a little older than the daughters were.
She was. She was. But she wasn't going to let the girls go by themselves. They wanted to do it, and she couldn't let them go by themselves, so she just rose to the occasion.
A chaperone.
Yes, exactly.
Wow.
Exactly.
That is great. Any other family members that want to spread the love a little this morning? Well, I see the time is fleeting, and I think we've pretty much exhausted our time that was allotted. I'll make another pitch for membership. If you'd like to join the Manchester Historic Association, we'd love to have you. This brochure is at the front desk. You're also all welcome to tour the museum while you're here for the rest of the day, and we'll be up here to talk if anybody has questions. So thank you all very much for coming. This was a great audience.